historically, we see Congress change when there's an influx of new members. So in 1974, what was called as the Class of 74 was a huge group of new freshman members that were elected after Watergate. And these members wanted to change the way that things were done. And a lot of the rules that I was just talking about were changed in the 1970s, partially as a result of this new energy from these new members. In 2018, we saw the most new members elected to the House since Watergate. And I don't think it's a coincidence that then at the beginning of 2019, we saw the Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress form and look at the way in which Congress can change things and reinvest in staff and do things like that. That's because of new members.
I am so damn tired of being lied to. I don't think I can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies, but I'm not gonna buy it anymore.
Hello, my friend, and thank you for listening to the 273rd episode of Congressional Dish. I'm your host, Jennifer Briney. If you've never heard this show before, thank you for trying it out, because I know that it is a tough sell to get someone to listen to a podcast about Congress. Because, wow, what a shit show Congress has been pretty much the whole time I've done this podcast, which has been for over a decade now. Now, most of the episodes of Congressional Dish are me doing deep dives into some kind of subject in Congress, whether it is covering congressional hearings or bills or laws or whatever it is. It's usually just me. But this is going to be one of the rare episodes in which it's going to be an interview, because I learned so much from my guest today. My guest today is Maya Kornberg, and she wrote a book called Inside Congressional Committees: Function and Dysfunction in the Legislative Process. And so I conducted this interview because I wanted to know what was going on inside of these committees, largely because we recently saw something happen which broke our show notes. You know, one of the things I do for this podcast that's really important to me is that I feel like trust is earned, especially considering I'm not a celebrity and most people don't know who the hell I am. And so what I do is when I give you information on Congressional Dish, I make sure that all of it is fact-checked and that I give you all my sources in that episode's show notes. If I give you a sound clip from inside a hearing, I give you the timestamp so you can go and listen to it in context for yourself. I pay an assistant to help me with this. Her name is Claire. She is amazing. And so we are making it very easy for you to find information from all of these episodes, whether you're doing it to fact check what I told you or if you're trying to continue your own education. And our episodes recently broke because of dysfunction in congressional committees. When the new Congress, which started in January, took power, there was a shift in power in the House of Representatives. The Democrats had it before, and then the Republicans now have the power, which means that the Republicans got control of the committees. And when that happened, we noticed that the archive of all of the hearings from the last Congress, which was 2 years long, in some of the committees, the archive was just gone. And so the links that we gave you to those hearings were gone. The links to the documents that were on those committee websites were gone. And we're still trying to figure out how to deal with the fact that that's even possible. And so when I had an email telling me about Maya Kornberg's book, I wanted to talk to her to understand what the hell is going on in these committees. Now, my intention with this interview was to just conduct the interview for my own education and air it on Patreon, but I learned so much that I've decided to make this a public episode. And so in this episode, in this interview, you're going to learn how and why the power of committees has shifted over time. You're also going to learn how the witnesses are selected for hearings. A lot of the things that I've assumed were true, but it's actually more nuanced, because it always is, than what I was assuming. We are also going to learn why the hearings archives disappeared and the trouble that Maya has as someone who researches for a living in Washington, D.C. I feel a little bit more confident in my own skills because it turns out that a lot of people have trouble with the way that the archives are structured, or let's say not structured. But there is actually some hope for improvement in that regard. She's also going to tell us about some resources for information that Congress has that we don't have access to. And then finally, my favorite part of this interview is she's going to tell us where we can find hope for improvements in terms of how Congress functions. Because, I started this podcast over a decade ago because I didn't know anything about Congress. And so what I decided to do for the first 2 years was read every bill that passed the House of Representatives, figuring I would learn by doing. And there were quite a few episodes in those first 2 years where I burst into tears, not because, I did cry over what they were trying to do to us for sure, but because some of the policies are bad. Some of them start new wars and poison our environment and, take our money and give it to a corporation. So I was definitely horrified by the policies. But there were a lot of instances where it was the process that I was finding the most disturbing behavior, because there was a way that I was taught that Congress is supposed to function, but the reality of it is so different. And so there is hope for some fixes, and Maya will tell us what those are. Now, before I get into the interview, though, I do want to take a second and be a little silly here. This has to do with the business model, and I have created a competition in my own head, but I really, really need Congressional Dish to win for my own mental health. And so I need to recruit you into this effort. So first of all, if you're new to this podcast, you're not going to hear any ads today or ever on Congressional Dish, because we operate on the value for value business model, which keeps this podcast free of the corrupting influence of corporate money. And it's basically the honor system. So I give you these episodes that are packed full of information. I give you the show notes that back up everything I say and allow you to continue your education. And in return, from whatever value you get from that, you're expected to return that value in some kind of financial form. And we have all kinds of payment methods, from old school ones like paper checks and PayPal payments to new school ones like Venmo, Zelle, Cash App, Bitcoin, and Patreon. And all of those options are listed for you on the support page on congressionaldish.com and in every episode show notes. But today, I want to focus on Patreon for a reason that I will admit is stupid, but I'm stuck on it. And only you can make this podcast victorious in a competition that exists only in my head. But I can't get it out of my head, because as of this recording, Congressional Dish has 941 patrons on Patreon. And thank you to every single person that is already a patron. But that means that we are knocking on the door of 1,000 patrons. And there's just something about that 4 digits that has me very excited. I know I'm being a total child about it, but it feels like a very big deal to me. And I know we're going to get there eventually, and it will be a very happy day when it happens. I have the faith. That's not the issue. The issue is that I really want that day to happen for Congressional Dish before it happens for We're Not Wrong. Now, if you're not in the know, We're Not Wrong is the other podcast that I co-host with 2 of my favorite humans, Justin Robert Young and Andrew Heaton. And We're Not Wrong, I understand why it's growing, because it is such a good show. And if you haven't listened to it yet, you should give it a try, because I really do think that listeners of this show would love it. Because all 3 of us co-hosts are impossible to put in a political or ideological box. So first, there's Justin Robert Young, who is our resident sociopath because he loves politics, to the point that he has named his own podcast Politics, Politics, Politics. And his show is all about the campaigns and the money races and all of the political nonsense that makes my stomach turn, that I go out of my way to ignore. But the thing is, what Justin does is really important, because I will never get the Congress that I want, the one that does things for the people as opposed to for the corporations and the military industrial complex. And I will never get the Congress that I'm yearning for, one where I can watch them craft bills that will make our lives better. Like, that's what I was hoping for, and I have yet to see it. But until the processes that Justin documents and is an expert in, until those processes are better, until we are using an election system designed to hire people for the job of legislating that somehow matches the qualifications to the job, we're not going to get the Congress that we need. So it really is important for me to pay attention to this, despite my not wanting to. And having Justin in my life is very important. And it is We're Not Wrong that makes me pay attention to it. And then there's Andrew Heaton. His solo podcast is The Political Orphanage, because he just feels, as I do, that there is no political party that accurately represents me in the United States, certainly not the Republicans or the Democrats. And Andrew is just a unicorn, a beautiful, wonderful unicorn in this world. He is a historian. He is a comedian. He is part-time British and yet a red stater who has like caught snakes and put them in bags. He always has these insane stories. Like, he's just amazing. He is just a lovely human being and the most sophisticated hillbilly who has ever lived. And then there's me, the government-focused, born and bred blue stater who travels full-time and focuses only on government. And we have brought our three audiences together to create a political commentary podcast that is pure joy for all three of us. Because while we talk about serious issues, we do so with laughter and a total awareness of our lack of ability to change a damn thing, which leads to friendly debates as opposed to fights. Because I feel like most political commentary shows are fights, and I don't enjoy that. It just gives me anxiety in my time off, but I love We're Not Wrong. I love recording it. I even listen to it again sometimes, especially the older episodes. I have so much fun with that show. So where it is such a fun show, I get that it's growing quickly. It should be growing quickly. It deserves to grow quickly, despite the fact that we haven't even tried to grow it at all. It's just happening. And as of this recording, on the 1-year anniversary, actually, of We're Not Wrong's debut, it already has 831 patrons. And don't get me wrong, I love that. I know that I am complaining about a bouquet of blessings here, but there is a Patreon competition going on in my head right now in a race to 1,000. And the score is 941 to 831, which might sound like Congressional Dish with the 941 is ahead, but that 941 has been built over the course of a decade. The 831 for my fun political commentary show has been built over the course of a year. And so when I look at that, big picture, we are getting, as a country, political commentary over researched news for a reason. Because even in my own career, it is crystal clear that the easy to produce commentary is clearly what pays right now. And so if we Americans want better news, we need to start paying for the researched newsy stuff, at least at the same level that we pay for commentary, or we are bound to continue to pave this road to idiocracy where commentary valued over research is bound to lead. And so it's with that thought in mind that I just really want Congressional Dish to hit that 1,000 patrons first. Which means that we need 59 people out of the many thousands who listen regularly to Congressional Dish to start paying for it. And $1 per episode to make this happen is fine. I get a lot of messages, from people who pay for the first time after many years of listening to the show. And you tell me that you're embarrassed that you haven't paid yet or that you can't pay more. But the thing is that I get that life is expensive, especially in the United States, where we pay out of pocket for so many services that are paid for with taxes in other countries that, don't have government officials who value maintaining a military presence in most of the countries on earth above all else. I know that it is financially hard to work a normal job and be financially secure here in the United States. I understand it, which is why we crowdfund the show. And so I have to tell you that $1 per episode works for me. And on Patreon, I'm only producing 2 public episodes per month. You only pay for the public episodes. And that schedule, 2 per month, is the schedule I've been maintaining for years, and I have no plans to change it anytime soon. So that means at $1 per episode, that's a commitment of $2 per month maximum on Patreon. And if you want to make sure that's a maximum, because every once in a while I do an emergency, extra episode. If you want to set it as a maximum, you actually have a way to do that on Patreon too. You can cap it at $2 per month. And just to put that into perspective, I went to the California Pizza Kitchen last week and it was $2.50 to add bacon to my barbecue chicken pizza, which by the way, you should totally do because it is delicious. But $2 per month is less than a side of bacon per month. Do you think that this podcast is worth a fraction of a few pieces of bacon? Well, if you do, please go to Patreon and support Congressional Dish. Now, when you get to Patreon, I do want to let you know that the pledge page is set to $5 an episode, but that's only because that's the lowest number that Patreon would allow me to post. You can change it to whatever you want to as little as $1. And to reiterate, that's fine by me. 0 is the only number that stings. And I'll tell you, when we hit 1,000 patrons, especially if we can beat We're Not Wrong to that number is going to really inspire me. And I don't know why. I think it has something to do with that 4th digit. Again, I'm a child, but I'm excited for this. That milestone is big to me. And if we can beat the political commentary show to that milestone, for me, and maybe even for you, I don't know, but for me, it'll be a small but mighty victory for information over opinion. And if you are sacrificing a side of bacon to make it happen, you might even save a pig as well. So everybody wins. And again, you can find the links to all of the payment methods on congressionaldish.com. Okay, so now that I've gotten my personal silliness out of the way, let me introduce you to Maya Kornberg, the author of Inside Congressional Committees, Function and Dysfunction in the Legislative Process. I hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I did. We've never met before, so thank you for coming on the show. Would you like to introduce yourself to myself and the audience and let us know about your book?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, and it's great to meet a fellow Congress nerd. Obviously, this is a topic that I really enjoy talking about. I'm a political scientist at the NYU Brennan Center for Justice. And I lead the elections and government programs research in a number of different areas, congressional reform being one of them, but also do work on misinformation and information and politics, as well as a number of different areas. And my new book, Inside Congressional Committees, Function and Dysfunction in the Legislative Process, was published just a few weeks ago by Columbia University Press. So I'm really excited to talk a little bit about it today and talk about why committees matter in Congress today and what we can learn from them.
Yeah, how did you decide upon this topic? Because it is quite wonky.
I wanted to understand how the legislative process works. We know that Congress is hyper-partisan and dysfunctional in terms of not passing legislation, not doing a lot of legislative work. We all hear about that. And so I wanted to really look under the legislative hood, as it were, and understand the mechanics. And that's where committees come in. I view committees as the legislative concourse leading up to bill passage. And so they allow us to unpack that story. And what I do in the book is to explain then what we can learn from this about what's working, isn't working, and also importantly, at least from my vantage point, what we can do to make things more effective.
Yeah, that makes sense. Do you happen to know, were committees always a part of Congress, or did they kind of come into being as time went on? Like, do you know the origins of the committees? Where did the structure come from?
Yeah, so committees have really been essential institutions in Congress, essentially since its inception. But as you hinted at, the way in which committees are organized has changed a lot over time. So the reason why committees formed to begin with is because Congress needed to delegate responsibilities for dealing with things. So they're kind of sub-organizations that perform specific duties. And by the early 1800s, Congress already had a good number of committees, and they performed a lot of the functions that they do today in terms of helping Congress write legislation and deliberate on specific decisions and oversee the executive. But then committees have changed a lot over the past 2 centuries in terms of their jurisdictions and the way that they're set up. Today's committees are written into the rules of the House and the Senate. And I would note that though the jurisdictions and the number of committees have changed a lot over the past 2 centuries, Congress has not changed the jurisdictions of its standing committees, that is, its permanent committees, since the 1970s. So it's been quite a while since it's done that. So now we have about 20 or some odd standing committees in each chamber. and their jurisdictions are divided by policy areas. Some of them do focus on procedural issues like House rules, for example, but by and large, they have not changed over the past 50 years.
Now, if they wanted to change them, is that something that would have to be done with a law, or is it kind of like the House rules, like the new party can come in and really change everything? Like, what would that process look like if they wanted to change that? Because I know that like we had the January 6th committee, which now no longer exists. So is it like that with all of them, or are there committees that are kind of more permanent and they can't be changed?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I think that the January 6th committee is definitely one of those committees that everyone knows about. But that committee is really unique. So the committees that I was just referring to are standing committees. That is, they're permanent committees. They're hard to change. They haven't changed in a while. But then Congress has and still continues to create these select committees. These are temporary committees that Congress might create in order to deal with a specific issue of the day, like the January 6th committee, but also Congress has started recent select committees on the climate or on COVID-19, on other issues. And those committees are temporary committees. They are easier to create with a resolution and, of course, do not benefit from the long-term staff and organizational memory of permanent committees, though. In terms of permanent committees, that is something that would need to go through the major procedural committees of the House and the Senate, like the House Administration Committee, for example, and Congress can choose to do that. I don't think that the major impediment to that is actually the rules themselves of changing that. Congress can change itself and has done so. I think that the politics behind that are what makes it complicated. Committees are a way in which Congress apportions responsibility for dealing with certain things. And the structures and the power dynamics around those committees and leading those committees have become relatively ingrained. And so anytime you're thinking about a change in Congress that takes power away from people who have power and changes the power dynamics within the chamber, that's not going to be so easy to do. And if you completely change the way in which committees are organized, then that's going to be something that's going to change some of the power dynamics.
Okay, so to do so, like, let's say, I don't know, they wanted to get rid of the House Transportation Committee, or like, who knows? They wouldn't be able to just do that by changing the House rules. It would have to go through a committee and then be a part of a bill? Is that what I'm hearing?
So in order to get rid of a specific committee, you can do that. That's something that, for example, Speaker Newt Gingrich did in the mid-90s. That is something that one can do by changing those rules that you just mentioned. And again, the reason that it hasn't been done is less so because those rules are so complicated to change, and I think more so because of the power dynamics as they stand. I mentioned Newt Gingrich. Newt Gingrich did other things that limited committees, so you don't have to completely just cut out a committee. You can also do things like reduce its staff, which Newt Gingrich did, and that also hurts the committee and their ability to do things. And the other thing that the Speaker has the power to do and has done over the past 2 decades since, say, what I'm talking about now, which is Newt Gingrich, is that many, many bills are not referred to committees. So the process of regular order by which a bill is introduced and then it's referred to a committee, and the committee has a lot of power, and then amending that bill and holding hearings. So that's another thing that we see happen less now than it did a few decades ago. So a few decades ago, there was more of what we call regular order, which is what I just described. And now frequently bills are written and introduced by party leadership and maybe a select group of lobbyists, and they're pushed through really, really quickly. And that also strips committees of their power. So even if you have committees, that does not mean that they are, first of all, they're never all equally powerful in terms of their jurisdictions. And secondly, there's ways that these committees can be stripped of their real, actual legislative power when they don't have staff or when they don't have that legislative power to be overseeing things.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because we actually have noticed that here on Congressional Dish so many times over the years, where I'll look at a bill and be kind of tracking its progress, and then you go online and it says that it died in a previous Congress, but it didn't. It actually got attached to a funding bill and dingleberried its way into law. We actually like dingleberry is a whole thing on this show because it happens so often. I mean, it seems like that's really diluting the power of the committees. Is that something in your interviews with staff and members of Congress, like, is that something that they're concerned about? Because it seems to be a bipartisan practice. What are they saying about that in Congress? Do they see that as dysfunction, or is that something that they want?
So just to clarify, you're talking about this new process by which committees are circumvented and don't hold that legislative power that they used to?
Sort of. It's like I'll see a bill get introduced and then referred to a committee. Maybe it even passes out of the committee and then it's immediately law. Or it looks like it wasn't law at all, which is very frustrating to me because it'll look like it died, but it actually became law attached to something else. So I'm just finding bills getting harder for people who aren't experienced in it to track, where I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the way it was supposed to work was bill gets introduced, it goes through a committee, then it goes to the House, then it goes to the Senate. If there's differences, then it goes back and forth. If it passes both the House and the Senate in the same form, then it becomes law. That seems to be the process that we were told, like how it's supposed to work. And what I'm witnessing is that the bill will either skip the committee entirely or it'll go through the committee, but then skip part of the other process and just it seems like a lot of legislating is happening in these monster omnibus bills that are doing so much more than funding the government. And my question is that something up there on that hill that is considered bad? Or is it now to the point that it's so common that that is just a norm, and the fact that the committees are getting cut out of the process and votes aren't even really happening on these bills, is that just something that's a new norm and we're all just supposed to accept it?
Yeah, so the process that you're referring to, I think, coincides with a number of congressional processes. So Congress is passing less legislation, and it's more likely that the legislation that's passed are these huge omnibus bills, as you're mentioning, that are many pages long and have a lot packed into them because that's the way to get things passed. And there's a number of reasons why I think that hurts the democratic process. First of all, when you have these huge bills being pushed through with little room for hearings, and sometimes even for members to read the bill, you don't have as many opportunities for these individual members to weigh in on the legislation. And you have a process by which representatives are getting elected to Congress, but their actual power to advance their legislative priorities on the floor is limited when they don't have the possibility of weighing in on these bills. And so I think that's one issue that is really, really problematic. And then the other thing is that Congress needs to learn about a lot of different subtopics, and it needs to specialize in things in order to be legislating effectively. It's a body of non-experts that need to legislate on a lot of very, very specific issues. And so the committee process that is now broken down was also traditionally a way in which they could hear from, say, a scientist from NASA or a farmer or, all of these different stakeholders that they need to hear from in order to be making informed decisions on legislation. So it's also a learning process that has been weakened in this way.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because I have found that watching committee hearings, one of the reasons I wanted to start Congressional Dish is because I was learning so much about not just like our place in the world, although that's also a big part of it, but just about these topics that I had never thought of before. And then all of a sudden there's these experts with these interesting stories and facts. And I mean, I feel like the national news should be telling us about these hearings every night because they're fascinating. But I do notice that the range of topics is so vast. It's really hard for me as the host of this show to catch myself up to even understand what's being discussed in these committees. And when I look at the witnesses that get called, I just see a lot of the same organizations over and over again. So like, for instance, if it's a foreign policy related hearing, I keep seeing the Atlantic Council. There's just these groups that just keep coming back. And so I'm really curious, how do these witnesses get selected? Because I'll also see, if it's a committee that's being run by the Democrats, there'll be 3 out of 4 witnesses kind of talking about the same stuff. And then the 4th witness will be completely from left field saying the opposite of everybody else. And it just kind of feels like that was a partisan witness. So like, how do they get picked? Am I right in my suspicion that 4th person was probably a Republican witness and the other 3 are probably Democrats? Or do they choose the witnesses together? Like, how are they doing this?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's more complicated than I can distill here. I'll try to give some of the headlines, but I have a whole chapter about this in my book for those who it's of more interest to, because it's a really complicated process and I do get into the nitty gritty of it. Traditionally, the official rules entitle the minority to one witness and entitle the majority to all the other witnesses. And that can be 2 witnesses, it can be 4 witnesses. It depends on the hearing, because of course the majority also decides what hearings it will call, and it decides which issues will get the time of day for a hearing. And then I talk in the book about how the traditional rules can sometimes be eclipsed by informal norms then, based on the relationship between the staff, based on the topic of the hearing, and based on the relationship of committee leadership. So that is the chair and the ranking member. So there's the official rules that I just laid out for you. But when the committee are on good terms, they can sometimes design the list together, as you just described, and come up with a list together of, oh, these are the folks I was thinking, these are the folks I was thinking, and who would make sense so that we can put together a cohesive panel. And one of the things I talk about in the book is that when there are these joint lists and these topics on which they can do this, then there's more of a space for real deliberative discussion where you hear from a wide range of views and you can reason through the different areas and the different aspects of a different policy debate. So there's that. I would also note that one of the things I talk about in the book are the different kinds of witnesses. So you talked about the fact that there's some witnesses who are coming to testify again and again, and people kind of already know what they're going to say. These are what I call labeled witnesses. They are witnesses who there's less freshness to what they're going to say. Perhaps they're already even associated with a partisan cause. Perhaps they're associated with a specific administration even. And so they come and they say similar things. There's also what I call unlabeled witnesses. These are witnesses who there is then, when I talk in the book about the openness of members to hear from different witnesses, there's more openness to hear what they have to say because they're unlabeled witnesses. They're witnesses who are coming in, you don't already know what they're going to say. And this obviously makes for a different kind of discussion. I would also note that I talk about the different kinds of witnesses in the book, and there are some witnesses who are coming to share their expertise, their technical expertise on a topic, but there's also some witnesses that either party might decide to bring in because of their lived experience of an issue. And this also illuminates then a different aspect of the issue. And so I think there's a lot of different kinds of witnesses, and they can be called for different reasons, for their backgrounds, for what they have to say, for the zeal with which they convey what they have to say. And this calculus changes based on a number of parameters that I discuss in that chapter of the book. The other thing that I would note quickly now, if we're talking about witnesses, and you made the excellent point that we see sometimes the same witnesses being called, is that Congress does not pay for witnesses to travel to DC to testify. So that's one issue out of a few that I'll list now that bias the pool of witnesses. Witnesses are usually folks who are in the DC area more often than not, and who are either in the personal networks of the staff, who are the ones who decide how to call witnesses, or the networks of the chair or the ranking member. Perhaps it's the parochial interests of the chair or the ranking member. Perhaps it's their professional background that leads a witness to be called. And perhaps it's their proximity to Washington, D.C. But either way, this witness selection process creates a huge bias in the kinds of voices that committees can hear from, and does not leave space for a full spectrum of voices that could be helpful to it in making these policy decisions. So I could go on and on about this, but I'll stop there because I think that there's so many different components to this, and it's a really, really intricate process.
No, that's really helpful. And you're just confirming some things that I had suspected, because it's, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about when the cameras are in the room. And one of the reasons is I notice different behavior when I watch a C-SPAN hearing versus a hearing that I'm just finding on YouTube, where the big cameras are not there and they don't think they're going to get a lot of press. I think the behavior tends to be less partisan and just more onto the issues on the off C-SPAN hearings. But let's stick on the selection of witnesses for just a second, because that did seem to be a little different during COVID, because they were allowed to call in Like, so I did see that there were people from like Stanford, for instance. There were scientists from Stanford that were called in to testify. And it seemed like there were people from all over the country in a way that I wasn't seeing. And I know that the House has gotten rid of proxy voting. But in your experience up on Capitol Hill, did that kind of change any of the vibes up there? Like, was there kind of like a light bulb moment where they became aware of this East Coast bias in these hearings, or was that not really a factor? Are we going to go back to the old ways now that it has to be in person? Do you think there's any chance that we're going to keep this video conferencing of witnesses to get the best witnesses? Like, is there any chance that that's going to be a thing going forward?
Yeah, I think that's a really excellent point. COVID forced Congress online. And I did interview witnesses and staff who were involved both before COVID and the traditional kinds of hearings and after COVID. And they talked about a real difference, both in the access to witnesses who could just zoom in from different parts of the country, but also in the kind of feel of the hearing. You mentioned part of why hearings on Capitol Hill and these hearings might feel different, and that's the media and the cameras there. But there's also the agenda is very regimented. Members go in and out. They sit in a very specific seating order with Democrats on one side and Republicans on the other, and there's very specific speaking times, and they're there in their suits. And when we had Zoom hearings, what I heard from folks was, oh, well, suddenly people are just there in their living room. It humanizes the conversation in a way. Their dog is in the background. Just by nature of the way in which Zoom works, it takes out some of that formality that I think can be constricting in some of the traditional hearings. And the other thing with Zoom hearings is that the infrastructure has already been built out. I spoke to one of the digital directors for a senator, and what she told me was, the infrastructure is there. And so that really is something that we can capitalize on. At the end of the day, it's up to individual committees and the new committee leadership that we have now to decide what kind of mix they would like of different kinds of hearings. Zoom hearings are one alternative to traditional hearings, but another thing I talk about in the book are field hearings, hearings outside of Washington that take members out of these echo chambers and bring them to different parts of the country, again, to both engage with a different witness pool than they might in traditional hearings, but also engage with each other in a different way. So I think that there's a lot of ways in which hearing formats can be innovated, and they are, but it's largely up to committee leadership to decide that. And there's a huge amount of variation between committees in how they function, how they hold their hearings, as I mentioned, how they select witnesses, but also in the hearing format.
Oh, interesting. So let's talk about that leadership for a second, because in the last couple of weeks, my assistant and I have been having issues because with the change in leadership in the House, there's been a change in where the files are located. So one of the things that I think is really important as just like a rando, podcaster is earning the trust of my audience. And so I have very extensive show notes. When I feature hearing in my podcast, I link not only to the hearing webpage, which gives you all the witnesses and all of it should have the documents. We can talk about that too, because I don't know where to find them. When they say like, we're going to submit this for the record, where's the record? I don't know. But they do have these committee websites. That's usually where you can find the videos. I always link to that. I give timestamps for the hearings. Like, we do a lot of work. And then the Republicans came in and our links all broke. And so we were doing some investigation. It wasn't just one committee. It was a bunch of them where it seems like the leadership, they come in and they put Republican or Democrat in the names of both the YouTube and the URLs. And then it all switches and all the links break. And I'm just kind of sitting here like, what is going on here? Because in my head, I would think that the committee is the committee and there might be different stewards controlling it, but they don't own the committee infrastructure. And yet that seems to be what's happening here. So we're in a bit of a crisis trying to figure out, like, how do we deal with this? But I'm having a bigger picture worry of, do these parties really think that these committees belong to them? Like, when they get in control of the leadership, do they see it as this is a committee that we are now operating, or is it my committee? It's our party's committee. Like, did you get kind of like a sense of how much control these parties think they have over these, like how much ownership they have?
Yeah, so I think what you're raising is actually two interesting points. One of them is just the lack of organization and accessibility of congressional documents.
Yeah.
As someone who does research using committee documents like transcripts, my book uses a large data set of committee transcripts to make my points. I had to go to either each individual committee website or the government publishing office and see what was there. It's a lot more difficult than we have in a lot of other countries that make this transparent and accessible. Now, one of the reasons for that is what you just mentioned. When committees change hands, that website changes. It's the majority who then controls that website. So it's no longer the same website as you might have had when the Democrats were in control. And that's very confusing, not just for you. I think it's just a confusing thing to do. I do think that you're right, that does reflect in a certain way the way that things are done. The chair has huge power over the way that things are done in the committee. The chair decides to hire or fire staff, and the majority obviously has most of the budget of the committee. So the majority has more staff to hire or fire, but the ranking member can also hire and fire the minority staff. So I would say that both leaders are important in that. The chair decides what hearings to hold. And as I mentioned, the chair and then the chair's staff can decide on which witnesses come to testify. That is a lot of power to shape the way that things are done. And that power is, as you correctly put, something that changes hands when either party can gain or lose control. There are many committees, I will say, though, who the chair might decide to retain the staff that a previous chair had, and that the staff are long-term staff who, just oscillate between being majority and minority depending on who's in control, and they're able to maintain their relationships. In the book, I talk about how that can help, because the committee needs some sort of organizational memory, as you're mentioning, but it's up to the chair, and some chairs can come in and they can decide, no, we're going to bring in a completely new staff that come with us. And the other thing that I might mention in this regard is that the Republican Party has term limits for chairs. And this creates also a lot more turnover potentially for new staff, because there obviously is an inclination, if you're having a new chair come in, to bring some new staff. And what is lost in that is some of that institutional working memory that helps committees, just like any other sub-organization, function properly. So there's really two issues here. One of them is Congress needs to work on its accessibility of some of its data, and it is taking steps in this. There's the Select Committee on Organization that has now become a permanent subcommittee in the House, that one of the issues that they've taken up is how to make data more accessible to members of the public. And then there's the second problem, or problem is perhaps too normative of a word, but the second issue, which is the way that committees operate, really gives the chair a lot of power and does not make space for some of this more organizational memory and organizational process that could be very helpful in strengthening committees as organizing structures.
That is fascinating. I'm glad to hear there's a new committee looking into this, because I said it on my, Patreon, or maybe my last episode, I don't know. We're kind of concerned that there's no rules for the internet age for Congress, for giving us the record, giving us the documents, giving us the hearings themselves. Has there been any rules put in place? Not just rules, but is there a law that is governing what the public is supposed to get? Or are we still in the era where the written word has to be put down and we have the right to physically go to the archives or whatever? Are we still dealing with laws that were written in the 1800s to govern the internet age? Because I am increasingly horrified, and I've been doing this for 10 years. I'm not new with looking for stuff on the internet, but the fact that my show notes can still break, what is governing what these committees have to give us and the long-term archives? Because I'll tell you one example, the House Oversight and Reform Committee, when James Comer came and took over, if you go and you look for anything that happened in 2022 and 2021 right now, it's gone. It's like those years didn't even happen on the website. So I'm just wondering, how is this possible? What's governing what they have to give us? Or do these committees really get to make it up as they go?
Yeah, so I think Congress is really far behind. As someone who I'm also a comparativist, so I look at other countries' legislatures. Congress is also far behind many other countries that have a lot of really interesting technology that helps them legislate and do other roles that legislatures are meant to fill. I will say that Congress has taken some steps. So I mentioned the Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress. That is a committee that was started by Nancy Pelosi in 2019. And it was meant to introspect and figure out what Congress can do better. And it's now become, in the 118th Congress, a permanent subcommittee of the House Administration Committee. And this committee has taken up a lot of issues, things that are very important, like congressional staffing, diversity in congressional staffing, expertise in congressional staffing, staff pay. But they've also taken up this issue of technology, and they had hearings about it. And now we have, for the first time, a digital service office in the House, which is really quite new. But one of the things that they're helping to do is to fill some of these gaps in digital services and at least create some sort of centralized process and standardization in the way things are done. Because one of the other things with Congress, and this happens with staffing, this happens with digital services, is that there's really a lot that is just up to the individual member offices and up to the individual committees. And that creates a huge amount of problems for Congress functioning as an organization. And this is something that people have looked at improving from a number of different ways. There's obviously the issue of access to information for you or I or other members of the American public and making things more accessible. And that's something that the committee has taken up. But there's also the issue of just cyber safety and cybersecurity that is really, really important to Congress and protecting itself from attacks. And so all of these things are things that I think it's heartening to hear, or at least things that Congress is, at least the House of Representatives is discussing right now. There's this committee. They've been making some progress, and they are trying to create something that is more centralized and more accessible to a broader swath of the American public.
Yeah, I mean, I obviously have selfish motivations for asking that question because I need these hearings for my show. But at the same time, I'm also thinking if I were a member of Congress who's expected to vote on a bill that originated in a committee on which I do not sit, I would like to go into the archives and make myself knowledgeable about the issue. Like, I feel like it's an education of Congress issue as well, unless they have some kind of repository or archives that we don't have access to. Is that the case, or are we all just kind of using the same chaotic system to educate ourselves? Because, like, it's one thing for me to be educated on the issues, but I really think the lawmakers need to be educated on the issues. So did they have tools that we don't have access to, or are they also looking for an archive that no longer exists?
Well, so one of the tools that I will say is super important to Congress, though it could be strengthened, is doing really important work, are the congressional support agencies. That's not something that you or I have access to, but these agencies like the Congressional Research Service or the Government Accountability Office or the Congressional Budget Office, they're there in order to help Congress and its members understand things. And so a committee or an individual member can ask them questions and they write reports in order to support those members. And that's a real key resource. The other thing that is not necessarily public are all of the briefing materials and other materials that the committee staff and the personal staff put together for members. There's a lot of preparation that goes into preparing the hearing, understanding the different angles of a piece of legislation that you're working on, all the work that staff do, that is not public, but that is really, really important in preparing their members. So I think that is why I really, really highlight in the book the centrality of the staff. The staff are so important because they're the ones who are helping to prepare the information for members that, as you're saying, is so important. And then I might also say that because of the lack of sufficient staff that Congress relies on, Congress today has several thousand fewer staff than it did a few decades ago, which is quite shocking. Congress can rely on external sources of information sometimes. One of those external sources of information are lobbyists. We think about lobbying frequently in the context of financial lobbying, but there's also what I call informational lobbying. Lobbyists can come in and give Congress information that, as you're saying, is so important because these members really need to be educating themselves. So there's a lot of different ways in which members get information, some of them public, some of them less public, some of them internal, some of them external if it doesn't have enough internal resources. That's why for a member of the public, it can be complicated to put together a story of exactly what these members are hearing before they make a decision.
That makes sense. I'm sitting here thinking, like, I have one person who's helping me with my research and I would die without her. And if I could have 10 of her, oh my God, I would. And when I think of Congress, their staff is being paid with other people's money. It's our tax money. So why on earth would they cut their own staff? How did that happen?
So one of the reasons that happened was because of an internal dynamic that I think is worth noting when we think about Congress. And it's also something that I talk about in the opening to the book. And that is the dynamic between parties and committees and legislatures. So historically, as well as internationally, as I mentioned, I'm a comparativist. So the United States is not unique in this. The power of committees and the power of political parties is inversely correlated. The stronger one is, the weaker the other one is, and that's because they're competing organizing structures within a legislature. As I mentioned, committees are there to organize things, to get things done. So are parties. And what we see over the past several decades is really that the Speaker of the House has centralized power. And we see similar dynamics in terms of the party leadership in the Senate. And a key person in this story is Newt Gingrich. So Newt Gingrich really did cut committee staff substantially. And when we view what he did in this context, we might understand it. If he disempowers committees, he actually empowers himself and party leadership, because information is power, because staff expertise is power. And so taking away power from the committees, taking away power from individual members can help the speakers and other power centers to maintain their power. So it's not so much a concerted decision on the part of all of Congress, and more so, I think, a part of that push and pull dynamic between parties and specifically party leadership and between committees.
So I'm hearing a theme that we have a lot of consolidation of power in the leadership, in the leadership in the committees, the leadership in the House and the Senate. Do you have suggestions about what we can do about that? Because I don't see how these really powerful individuals are going to give that up and go back to the way things either were or how we want them to be. Or is this something that's acknowledged as a problem throughout the Capitol and they're working on it? Like, what do you think the path forward should or could be?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. And as we were saying earlier, people with power don't necessarily usually like to give that power up. That's a tough change to make in any organization. Historically, we see Congress change when there's an influx of new members. So in 1974, what was called as the class of 74 was a huge group of new freshman members that were elected after Watergate. And these members wanted to change the way that things were done. And a lot of the rules that I was just talking about were changed in the 1970s, partially as a result of this new energy from these new members. In 2018, we saw the most new members elected to the House since Watergate. And I don't think it's a coincidence that then at the beginning of 2019, we saw the Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress form and look at the way in which Congress can change things and reinvest in staff and do things like that. That's because of new members. And the other thing that I think is necessary for Congress to change is this relationship between parties and committees and kind of the other power centers. And we're also at an interesting time with that. So we see, as I've told you, this kind of historical push and pull between parties and committees. And in that context, we have now a speaker who's relatively weak, even if over the past several decades, as an institution, the speakers of the House have become more powerful. Now we see a speaker with Kevin McCarthy who's leading a divided Congress, who's facing a motion to vacate. And that exposes then some fault lines. And I think can pave the way, if there's a weaker speaker, for committees to regain some of that control. The other thing I'd point out is that I was talking about new members. We see key committee leaders of Ways and Means and Budget and Homeland Security. These are not just new chairs. These are chairs with relatively little experience. The current chair of the Ways and Means Committee is one of the most inexperienced chairs ever. And so in the context of what I was saying, of having new members and having new energy and new ways of thinking, actually having chairs who are coming in with relatively little congressional experience can yet again, I think, pave the way for some interesting procedural changes. So I don't necessarily think that it's an acknowledgement in Congress as an institution of what can be done better. And I think it's all of these different dynamics that push and pull it in different directions, and together can create kind of the perfect storm for certain kinds of changes in Congress.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. Get some new blood and you get new things to happen. That makes perfect sense. You know, speaking of power, what kind of power do we have, especially over the committees? If your member of Congress sits on a committee, then you have more power over that particular issue and you should be more vocal. But that also means that if that is true, if your member of Congress doesn't sit on a committee and yet there's an issue you're really passionate about and your member of Congress has nothing to do with it, your power is kind of limited. Or is that a lie? Like, can we call a committee directly and actually be heard? Or is it our member of Congress is our only path to being heard? How can we best utilize our own power over these people?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. Given the diminished power of committees, which we've been talking about relative to the speaker, I also think that even being on a committee might not necessarily mean that your member has time to read a bill and have hearings about a bill because of what we were talking about earlier with these big bills getting pushed down. The other thing is that not all committees are equally important. And by important, I mean equally powerful in terms of advancing key pieces of legislation because of their jurisdictions. So it really matters, I think, also which committee they're on. But in terms of people as individual members, committee hearings are open to the public. They are meant to serve the entire American public. And as such, though you might have more direct access if your specific member is on a committee, you can reach out to a specific committee and given specific issue areas that they might be focused on or specific pieces of legislation, they might be interacting with some kind of regionally specific issues. They might even be holding a field hearing in your area that you could attend. So there's a lot of ways, I think, to engage with committees that don't have to go through your member. But of course, if your member is on a committee or if your member is the chair of a committee, then you might have a lot more direct access. Or that committee, for all the reasons that I talked about before with witnesses, might be focusing a little more on your district than they would if the chair was not your member. So I think that there's a lot of ways to get engaged and to hear about what's going on. And committees are great in the sense that they are public and they are for public consumption, and they are a way in which Congress can engage with the entire American public when they're done right.
So for those of us who don't live in DC, we can't physically show up to a hearing. If we were to email a committee or call a committee, they actively do constituent services? They'll talk to us and listen to us? Is that correct?
Yeah, so constituent services in Congress, which are also less organized than they might be in some other legislatures around the world, and this is also something that the Select Committee on Modernization has taken up. Constituent services are traditionally done by individual member offices. That's who's doing constituent services in a more robust way.
I think that was the wrong term, not constituent services where they'll help you get something out of government, but more like I have transportation on the brain with the whole East Palestine derailment. So it's I care about this a lot. If I wanted stricter transportation safety measures, not because I'm in East Palestine, but because I'm an American who's anywhere near a railroad ever, if I were to call the Transportation Committee, would I have an avenue to be heard?
So you can call the committee. And again, it really depends on who that specific staff is and how that committee works in terms of how far your specific issue is going to get. But you can call committees, and committees are public-facing organizations that folks can be involved in. Now, I mentioned that there's a huge variation in the way that committees do this, and so I might hold up some really excellent examples of this that have been done recently. The Natural Resources Committee in the House held a really, really interesting series of hearings and opportunities for public input about the Puerto Rico Status Act. It made a real point of having these public forums in English and in Spanish where people could come in and share their experiences, as well as allowing for online suggestions from a larger group of constituents, and in that way to make real informed decision about the piece of legislation. They did a similar collective process for the Environmental Justice for All Act a few years ago, which allowed for several hundred environmental justice groups and organizations to comment on a piece of legislation and get even more involved. So I do think that there are also, beyond the kind of traditional examples that I talked about how Congress sets up a hearing, there's also these committees that are doing all these innovative things that folks can get involved in and show up at and have their voice be heard, I think, in an even greater way because of these new innovations in the way that committees do their work.
Oh, I love that. I didn't know about any of that. Finally, you mentioned that there's a difference in the power of each of the committees. What are some of the most powerful ones that we should be watching?
So in the House, powerful committees are the Ways and Means Committee, the Natural Resources Committee, obviously the Rules and Administrations Committees in both chambers are powerful committees because, as I mentioned, those are the ones that really set the rules, including what committees there even are in Congress. In the Senate, you also have committees like Senate Finance or Senate Commerce or Foreign Relations that are really committees that oversee these really important industries. A Senate Help Committee, I would also say. So these committees that have jurisdiction over hugely important pieces of congressional spending or legislation are really the important committees. And the committees that have kind of more limited jurisdiction might be then obviously limited in their power to affect kind of key pieces of legislation. So, for example, House Veterans Affairs, while extremely important because of the tremendous importance of the subject matter that it deals with, is less central to advancing a lot of key pieces of legislation that we might be interested in moving forward today.
That makes perfect sense. So you've answered all of my questions, but is there anything that you think that we should know about Congress or any suggestions about how to fix it? Just anything we didn't cover that you've uncovered in your own research that you think we should know as a bunch of Congress nerds?
I would say that, first of all, one of the things that my book highlights is the complexity of the way in which things are done. And I think that if you really want to kind of understand a more nuanced picture of it, that's what it does. Congress is not all dysfunctional. I think that's my main takeaway. There are a lot of pieces of it that are dysfunctional, to be sure, and we know those. We hear those in the news. But when you unpack the process, as I do, and that's part of my argument, that you can see the different parts of it that might still be working. And then I think you can really focus your energies on ways to make it better. And I've noted some of them, but I might just highlight them one more time. Things like investing in staff, things like rethinking hearing formats, things like rethinking the ways in which we structure the partisan relationships between the chair and the ranking member and their respective staffs. Innovations in those areas can really, really help us to make Congress even more functional than it is. And Congress is really the people's branch. So I think, as I'm sure all the listeners do, that it's such an important branch for us to be thinking about in this way and working on innovating.
I agree with you completely. Hence why I've dedicated my life to watching it. Yeah, I love Congress. And I find your message of not all of it is broken to be such a good one, because there are so many hearings that I've watched that are surprisingly not partisan, where they're asking good questions and they're getting interesting answers. And then a bill will come out of that committee, become law, and solve a problem. Surprise medical bills is a great example of that. So I've seen Congress function, and I'm so happy that you have written this book and taken the time and are trying to get that message out, because I have faith that we can make that institution better. Like you said, it's ours. So you've done really important work. Again, your book is called Inside Congressional Committees, Function and Dysfunction in the Legislative Process. I will be sure to put a link to it in our show notes. Thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it. It was very nice to meet you.
Thank you so much for having me. I was honored to be here and really enjoyed the conversation.
It's always so fun to meet a fellow Congresswonk, especially one who knows so much more than I, and someone who got her information from the inside. Again, that was Maya Kornberg, and I recommend that you check out her book, Inside Congressional Committees, Function and Dysfunction in the Legislative Process. And as I reflect back on that interview, the part that's going to stick with me, I'm pretty sure, is her analysis of how things change in Congress over the years. She said it happens with an influx of new members. And how many times have we said that we need to fire them all in Congress? And looking back historically, Maya found that when we actually do that, when we put new people in charge, changes happen. And I am pleased to tell you that 2024, next year, is our next chance. I do love that part of our Constitution, the part that allows us to elect new people so often. Every 2 years, we have the power to replace the entire House of Representatives, and our next chance is just next year. But this is the time, as we go into the summer of 2023, to be recruiting people to run who you want to vote for. And I can't tell you how to do that or who the right person is for your district. If you want advice on how to get people to win elections, Justin is the one you need to talk to. But that remains where my hope lies, in the constitutional ability for us to replace the House of Representatives every 2 years. In fact, that is what got me to start this show way back in 2012, because I saw that as a nonviolent path to radical transformation in our dysfunctional government. I see that path through the House of Representatives in our ability to replace everyone in it, and quickly, should we choose to organize and do so. And so to have an expert find hope in that same path, I have a renewed sense of purpose with this, because I still have hope in the House, despite this current group of representatives hosting quite the shit show. But it doesn't have to be this way. It doesn't have to stay this way. And so I'm going to keep documenting the chaos, and I'm going to document the damage so that hopefully after things, I don't want it to be like this, but I'm pretty sure that it's going to be after things get bad enough that Americans finally focus and use our power on a mass firing in Congress. Until that happens, I'm going to keep documenting the legal damage so that when that day comes, the legal damage can be undone. And again, to support this effort, all of the ways to pay me for this work and to make this podcast successful enough to hopefully inspire copycats, please visit the support page on congressionaldish.com and pay in whatever method works best for you. And I would like to thank 2 people in particular, because they have now paid a cumulative $535 each, which makes them an executive producer. If you are a new listener to Congressional Dish and you liked this episode, although I must tell you this is different, you should probably try some other episodes, more of the deep dives, to get a better sense of what this show is regularly like. But if you want to do that, you should go to the most valuable episodes page on congressionaldish.com, which is a list that has been curated by our executive producers. They are literally the most valuable episodes, because the more executive producers put their name on an episode, the higher up that episode goes on the list. And so we now have an executive producer credit on episode 271, restricting TikTok. So thank you, Aaron Hahn, for supporting that episode. And I would also like to thank Lance Rogers, who is now our executive producer, on episode number 105, which was an episode that I did essentially for fun about the anthrax attacks way back in 2001. And Lance sent in a message along with his executive producer credit. And he said, "My name is Lance, and I'd like to produce the anthrax episode. It is my personal favorite episode of any podcast," which I find to be such a high compliment. Thank you for that. And thank you for putting an EP credit on that one, because that will move it higher up the list. I'm surprised that it's not already higher up the list, because that's one of my favorite episodes too. In fact, fun fact, I produced that episode in a period of massive transformation in this podcast, because up until that episode, I was still trying to read all of the bills. And it was really with the anthrax episode that I waved the white flag of surrender and realized that that was an impossible goal. I hadn't taken a vacation in years. It was just way too much of a workload, even though I still to this day feel like it should be possible to read all of the bills before they get a vote, because in theory, that's what our representatives and senators should be doing. They're clearly not doing that because it was impossible for me to even do with one branch of Congress. And it was with the anthrax episode that I said, you know what? I'm going to do this by topic now. Instead of trying to read every bill and tell people what was in it, I'm going to do this based on whatever subject is interesting to me. And I picked the anthrax attacks because I didn't know what the hell happened with those. And after I dug into it, even the stuff that I thought I knew was completely off. It's been years since I produced that. That was the 105th episode. We're on 273 today. So I don't remember the exact details, but I do know that the guy that I thought did it didn't do it. Didn't do it. They don't know who did it. Like, so if you want to listen to a really entertaining episode that still stands up to this day, 105 Anthrax has now moved up the list of most valuable episodes. And I'm really happy that that happened. So thank you, Lance. And then, thank you, Aaron Hahn, of course, because restricting TikTok, I think, is really important right now, because with that episode and the Twitter Files episode, there's some craziness happening with what our current government officials are trying to do when it comes to censoring the internet. And that episode is a big part of that. So I'm glad that that moved up the list as well. But if you would like to move your favorite episode up the list, it's $535. You can do it all at once. And some people absolutely do that. They send in a PayPal or a paper check for $535, put their name on the episode, and up the list it goes. But it's also cumulative. So if you've been supporting this show on Patreon or with paper checks or with PayPals or whatever, you can email my sister who does my accounting, Lauren@congressionaldish.com, and check and see where you're at. We've been keeping track since about 2017. We have very detailed records from the point that I was able to start paying my sister to do my accounting. Before that, I was doing my accounting in pencil on envelopes. It was not a sophisticated system. But if you check with Lauren, she can tell you how close you are. And every time you hit that number, you get to put an EP credit on an episode. And by the way, it doesn't have to be your name either. You can put it anonymous or whatever name you want, as long as it's not obscene. And this is open to everyone. So if you want to participate in that, it is available to you. But yes, thank you to everyone who supports this show. I will be back with an episode about the East Palestine train derailment in the next couple of weeks. That'll be your second episode in May. Until then, take care of yourself. Thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
We're surrounded now by liars coming at us through our TV screens.
We don't have a domestic spying program.
They're content to fight in black and white despite the many in-betweens. We got a president who plays with the facts. And then he waves a flag to cover his tracks. As if a lie is alright, in the end he'll justify the means. Now we are so damn tired of being lied to.
The polar ice caps aren't going away.
We don't think we can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies. But we're not keeping quiet anymore. We are so damn tired of being lied to.
Government jobs consume the profits of the private sector.
We don't think we can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies. But we're not keeping quiet anymore. Now we're not keeping quiet.
These bills represent common sense, bipartisan solutions that actually solve problems.